Good afternoon, everybody. We can just see you all joining now. So I'll just do an introduction while you're all joining. A big warm welcome to everybody, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. My name's Sarah. I'm part of the marketing team here at Parkside, and we're really delighted to bring you this webinar today. It's all about celebrating the launch of our new ceramic wall tile collection called Matrix. I'm not going to give you a sales pitch, but just so you know, Matrix is a range of 23 colour options. All available with matching grouts and trims. So what we try to do is create a collection that you can have a really coordinated look if you want to, or you can mix and match and create something a little bit different. So if you want to know more about that range, then just head over to our website, parkside.co.uk after this to have a look and let us know what you think about the collection. As I said, the collection is all about the colours, and that's where the idea for today's webinar came from. We've got a great panel for you, a really diverse range of backgrounds and experiences. So big thank you to them for their time in advance, and hopefully you'll all get something out of the discussion today. You will see there's a chat button, so if you want to introduce yourself, then please go ahead and do that. And there's also a question and answers, so you can submit a question to the panellists. And thank you to those of you that have already sent in a question. We will do our very best to get through as many of those towards the end of the session, but I can probably guarantee now we won't get enough time, so we will try and follow up all of the questions individually with you afterwards with a response from one of the panel members. I think that's enough from me for now. So I'm just going to ask each of the panel to introduce themselves, and then we'll hand over to Jo to guide us through the next sort of hour or so. So I'll do it in alphabetical order, I think. So Ben, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. So my name's Ben Channon. I'm head of wellbeing at Assael Architecture. So I'm an architect by trade, but now my role really is specialising in health and wellbeing within the design of buildings. I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about that as the event goes on.
Great, thank you. And Constantina?
Yes. My name is Constantina Tsoutsikou. I'm an interior designer. I'm the founder of Studio Lost. Our work is in hospitality, luxury hotels, restaurants, bars, and wellness. We work internationally.
Great, thank you. Hamish?
Hi, thanks, Sarah. My name's Hamish Kilburn. I'm the editor of Hotel Designs, which is the leading international hotel design website. We cover everything from daily news, features, reviews, and we're also going live with our first look on Matrix collection tomorrow. So look out for that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Over to Vanessa.
Hi, I'm Vanessa Konig. I'm an interior designer, and I also have a paint business called Konig Colours, and I work as a colour consultant, and I'm an interiors illustrator as well. I was involved in the colours with Parkside and getting the colours for Matrix together. So yeah, it's great to see it launched.
Oh, thank you. And over to you, Jo, in your safe hands.
Oh, well, hello. I was going to say hello, and I'm Jo, and I edit and founded Work in Mind, which is a website that's dedicated to content around healthy buildings. So thank you very much for letting me chair today. So, right, so it's all in my hands. So I suppose I wanted to start off with really a question, which I think mostly initially, Ben, if you don't mind, is directed at yourself. I wondered if you could give us a bit of a picture of the wellbeing piece right now and how things have changed in the last kind of 2-3 years, because you really are a leading voice in the sector, in the built environment. Can you give us a bit of an idea of that sort of shift and how you're seeing it, and then we can move on to the colour?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose big picture is well-being is really a rapidly growing industry in terms of design and architecture. So as a bit of background, I wrote a book nearly 3 years ago now called Happy by Design about the relationship between buildings and mental health. And to be perfectly honest, I think when it came out, a lot of people thought I was a bit of a weirdo. They didn't really, see that connection between buildings and well-being. Obviously, the Well Building Institute has been pushing that for a while, but really it's only over the last 2 or 3 years that I think we've really seen the broader construction industry get on board with that and really start to embrace it. We know now that the kind of wellness real estate market is growing at about 9% a year. So estimated value pre-COVID, obviously, of about $150 billion worldwide. So it's a huge market, and it's something that people are really engaging with now and embracing. I think largely down to the fact that the public are getting a much better understanding of health and well-being, and obviously things like mental health as well. And
do you think that that's across the built environment and all, you know, all job roles, if you like? Is it from architects to designers to the client? I mean, what are levels of understanding like, and how do they differ? Because I think that'd be interesting for this conversation.
Yeah, it is interesting. So the reason I wrote my book was because I felt that, you know, it wasn't really getting taught in architecture schools. Environmental psychologists and neuroscientists were discovering all this really fascinating stuff about the relationship between buildings and our minds, and it wasn't getting taught at architecture schools. But I would say now, gradually, definitely architects are getting better versed in this subject. I think in terms of clients and developers, it really it varies. Much like sustainability, you'll get some clients who are really keen to make green, eco-friendly buildings, and some clients to whom that's quite a low priority. And it is the same with well-being. But what we are seeing now is, in terms of trends, 60% of homeowners saying they'd be willing to pay more for a healthy home, for example. 95% of homeowners consider their health and well-being important in relation to their home. So clearly there's an appetite for it, and I predict that over the next few years, particularly in lieu of this pandemic, we're only going to see that market grow and grow.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Constantina, I wonder if you can help us with sort of a sub-question to that, really. But I mean, what does, in your world and the projects that you're working on, how big a deal, how dominant is well-being as a part of the brief? I mean, how often does it come up, or is it you having to push that to the client?
I mean, in hospitality, it's all about making people feel good. And that's always the first priority. You know, it's a guest-led design. You always think about, you know, how do people feel when they enter, when they come in, when they use the space. And we're talking about a variety of different kind of emotions as well. So you may have a space which is a bar or a restaurant, and you want to be kind of upbeat, or you may want to relax and really, you know, kind of like calm down and rejuvenate in a wellness space. So we always think about all these, you know, the emotions and how we work with materials and colors. But there's not a textbook kind of answer. So it's always a process of discovery, and there's a lot of elements that come into play. Now color is a fantastic ally. So color really helps us, you know, animate and bring out what we want. I don't know that there is you know, a recipe or a science that says, you know, A, B, C, D, and I do believe that a lot of it is also intuitive. You know, like how when we put things together and we make a composition, how does that make us feel? So I work with color intuitively, you know, and with different tones and different colors, and because our work is international, there's always a different starting point. Color is different in the Northern Hemisphere, in a warmer climate where I am now. I mean, stronger colors, and the light is so strong. So it's always about how light comes into play, architecture, the environment around us, all those parameters when we think about how we get to a scheme.
Yeah, thank you. Vanessa, I wonder, because your world, the projects you're working on are mostly domestic and homes. What about how you perceive kind of well-being and the projects that you're working in, and how big a thing is that for you and your client?
Well, it's quite important. I think it's people are very concerned about creating spaces that are kind of sanctuaries, and I think that's something to do with how we're all living these days. I think that our lives are so busy. Obviously, in the last few months, we've all spent a lot more time at home. But before that, you know, I have clients that travel a lot. They don't spend much time at home, or you know, they have many homes sometimes, and they want to make sure that the way it's designed and the colours that are chosen are going to make their homes feel, you know, kind of special and calm, and I think that's been reflected very much in the change of colours that people have been bringing into their homes. So, you know, for a long time we were having a lot of greys and then pinks and greens and all these kind of colours, which I think are very much kind of going back to nature and kind of calming. So I guess in that respect, that's where I'm seeing the kind of well-being side, that people want to create these spaces that are sanctuaries. And it's really interesting seeing it, actually. But then again, doing homes, you know, people have got to live in the homes and they've got families and they have to be practical, and so they may isolate certain areas that they kind of go, this is going to be my little space, I want it to be like this, I want this to be somewhere I can go and have quiet time, or away from children. And so there are lots of different elements that well-being comes into play, and you know, different to the commercial side, and I, you know, imagine with hotels. And so it's it's interesting, and it's definitely becoming something that people are really wanting to make sure that they have in their homes.
And it's a common vocabulary, it's something that people understand what to ask for. Is that, would you say that's fair?
I think so, but I think also sometimes it's, as a job as a designer, is you have to educate them and offer them things. So it's, in my role, I have to really understand who my clients are and how their lives run, and propose designs and you know, that work for them, and sometimes, you know, put the well-being forward, and they may not have thought about it, but I'll say, why don't you do this with colours, or however it is in the architectural side or the design side. But people are very open to it, and I think that's interesting. I think it's now become very acceptable, and people want to now embrace it as much as possible.
Thank you. I mean, moving on to the commercial sector, and perhaps looking at leisure, which is where Hamish can help us. I mean, Hamish and I had a chat last week, and he said something very interesting. He said, you know, we're living in very strange times, and we won't bother spelling out the obvious, but he said, you know, colour is going to play an enormous role in a wider sense of well-being, about how we make spaces feel. We were talking about Hamish's sector specifically in this regard, but, you know, sort of hotels and leisure. But Hamish, I mean, what is the picture looking like for the people that you work with in your role, the projects that you see from a well-being perspective, and how are we going to use colour to make people feel safe and secure, because it's going to be challenging, isn't it, otherwise?
Yeah, of course. So stating the obvious with COVID-19, there's, you know, everyone's more aware of well-being than they ever have. I feel as if what's interesting with this conversation and others we've had recently on hotel designs is that what we're talking about now, we were talking about anyway before the pandemic. It's just something happens culturally to allow us to amplify this conversation. And so what I was saying, Joe, was that colour is going to play a huge role, but it's going to play a huge role subconsciously, and no longer will it be acceptable just to slap colour here and there just to create a brighter space. I feel as if, and this was happening before, as I mentioned, but there's more meaning when it comes to decisions between interior designers and architects when it comes to injecting colour. And another thing as well I want to just mention is that, you know, COVID-19 and the pandemic, it's really raised this whole topic around well-being, and, you know, as people, we tend to really understand a topic when it's happened to us personally. I mean, we probably all know someone who's been affected mentally by the pandemic, COVID-19, or just being in lockdown. And I feel as if at the end of this, designers will come out of it with a new sort of perspective, mainly on how they look at their designs in order to sort of evoke that wellness, and obviously using colour.
And presumably for any, particularly in your sectors, and perhaps Constantina can kind of pick up on this, but particularly in the hotel sector, particularly any business of any size that doesn't make some investments in this, and perhaps colour is the way to go, is going to fail desperately, aren't they? Because Joe Public is going to feel very, very insecure for a very long time.
Yeah, you know, Constantina made a really good point when she said there's not it's not a one size fits all. There isn't an answer. There's not a book that gives us the answer on how to design these spaces for a better purpose. You really have to look at the brief, and you really have to, as a designer and an architect, I believe, really stay in your lane. If you're creating a hotel that is, its pure purpose is to evoke sleep performance, for example, from the moment you walk into that space, it needs to evoke that tranquility. But then on the other side, if you're creating a hotel that's more wild, like the W brand, for example, maybe you want to create wild and wacky you know, lighting schemes. It really does depend on the brief, and that's what Constantina was saying. But I do feel as if, you know, hotels, their purpose going forward will be more to sort of create this sense of this belonging and this sense of welcoming people into a tranquil space. Definitely. Constantina, I don't know what you think about that.
Oh, just to check, my sound is better now. Is that good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. I think there's definitely more of an appetite now for color, and we seek it. There's a lot of options, like now with the tiles is an example. There's a lot more tools for us to play with, and I don't know whether it was also because of you know, a saturation of, you know, too much design going on and surrounding us, and you know, color helps us to have a point of view and to differentiate, and I think that may also be a reason why we kind of seek it, and also because of the way we feel. It helps us express ourselves. We have a project that we're working on now, and I have to say, I think it's the most colorful yet. Even in areas that you wouldn't think. Like the other day, I was we chose to make some basins for bathrooms in pistachio green, and we just got the colors through from the factory, and they came out fascinating, and we chose to do some more in a different, like a very dark red color, and all of those things, you know, like happening right now. I think we'll see a lot more, in a way, risk, you know, a lot more risk in terms of using color. But I think that's exciting.
I was looking at it. Is Vanessa, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I absolutely. I think that I think people are becoming braver with color as well. I think that thanks to social media, actually, and people you know, seeing so much more, obviously with Pinterest and everything, people are kind of excited, and they're getting braver. I think that color is becoming much more part of people's lives, and even if they start off with not necessarily painting walls or using brightly colored tiles, they use it in the furnishings and the fabrics, and I think it's quite exciting. I think it uplifts people. I think it doesn't mean to say you have to have a riot of color, but you know, to have some color in different rooms, and it's great. It kind of makes you feel good.
Then on the subject of perhaps workplace, which I'm really keen to pick up on, because I suspect a lot of people watching this will be involved in some way in workplace projects, or even working in workplaces. You know, we're going to have the big subject of reoccupation, don't we, which is a word that has suddenly come into the kind of common parlance. We've talked about hotels. Do you have a sort of a sense, I know you've written about it, you've certainly written about it on Work in Mind, but about how we might use colour to make people feel safer, secure, in the global sense of the word, in the workplace, about coming back to work? You know, the Prime Minister is now suddenly changing his vocabulary on this, isn't he?
Sure. Well, I suppose the first thing to say is lockdown's made us realise that anywhere can be a workplace, and everywhere has been a workplace. So that's one thing to think about. And I think moving forward, we potentially are going to live in a world where flexible working is much more likely. A lot more people are working from home, and actually employers will need to really start to think about how suitable employees' homes are for home working. So I mean, we won't go down that rabbit hole, but it's just an interesting aside. But yeah, it's something we're really interested in at the moment, because everyone, as you say, is going to be now gradually returning to the office. I am lucky enough to be back in our office. We've got a space for 100 people, so we can get about 30 of us in here at the moment. So we're gradually having a phased return, which is really nice. And you can see some colours behind me. But yeah, I think a lot of people are understandably very nervous and anxious about returning to work. And as kind of Hamish was saying as well, colour has that ability to be calming, to be reassuring. I'm sure the last thing any of us would want is to walk back into a workplace with, you know, big screens everywhere that stinks of bleach and actually feels a bit more like a laboratory than an office. So I think as well, it goes back to some of the points Vanessa was making earlier on, really, and some of the questions I've seen already popping up in the Q&A about how can we actually use colour to be calming and to really reassure people. And surprisingly, there's not tons and tons of empirical evidence. We can go on to talk about this later, I'm sure, but there isn't tons of empirical evidence about the impact of colour. But one thing we do know is that as humans, we respond really, really well to nature. It's this concept called biophilia, which literally means love of nature. And because we evolved as a part of nature, although we often forget that, living in big cities, a lot of us now, but we are naturally drawn to nature. We love it and we find it very calming. It's why we find plants and puppies and water really, really calming and pleasant to be around. So definitely, I think drawing on those colours from nature that Vanessa was talking about, those kind of softer greens and blues, really can have that ability to be calming for us and remind us of kind of more natural things, even if we can't necessarily get real views of nature or loads and loads of plants in an office or workspace.
It would be interesting to ask the panel, we'll try and work out who's best to ask first, but I'm interested in fear of colour. I sort of take a view that perhaps, I'm not saying this about all nations, but I think certainly the Brits have a bit of a fear of colour, and I think you only need to, you know, look around and sometimes on the television to sort of be surprised at the lack of colour in people's homes, particularly, I'm thinking. But I kind of see a lot of, certainly in my work in mind, where offices are full of it now. They're full of colour, but homes perhaps some homes, you know, less so. From a wellbeing perspective, you know, surely we need to be encouraging the sort of domestic market, if you like, to kind of perhaps catch up with some of the things going on in the commercial market. I mean, Constantina, do you want to pick that up about the differences between, you know, homes and commercial, but with that sense of perhaps even cultural differences in fear or acceptance?
Mm-hmm. I think people sometimes are scared of colour, and I think that the reason that they're scared is they feel that there is some kind of recipe where if you get it wrong, it's completely wrong. But I think the best approach is to just experiment. Yeah. And just choose what you like, and it's okay to get it wrong. You can always repaint that wall, and sometimes you need to paint it 4 or 5 times, you know. I mean, I make mistakes all the time. Hopefully they don't cost the client too much. But colour is something I think that you have to explore and work with and try things out, and only then you kind of get to where you want to be. It's not going to be the first time, oh, I got it and it's spectacular. It's a trial and error, and you know, you start off with a small, you know, the paintbrush samples and in the small scale, and then gradually you get bolder and more confident, and you go bigger. So that would be my advice: is to just try it, see how you feel, and step by step. Yeah, there is no right or wrong. You know, what I might find really exhilarating and fantastic, somebody else might find overwhelming. So it is down to personal taste. Obviously, when it comes to commercial projects like, you know, hotels and restaurants and bars, and you know, that there are a lot of other factors to consider. So we want them to be busy and for people to like being in those spaces. But these are, I mean, we're talking about design on a certain level. So, but for the average person who's doing their house up, or they're thinking about a renovation or something, I think it's fantastic to just have fun.
Great advice. Hamish, have you
I've got an answer from a commercial perspective, and I just feel as if, from the projects that I look at, I feel as if hospitality has a real responsibility to sort of showcase what you can do with colour and, you know, the different options. Because as I said about choosing your lane as a designer when you're designing a project or designing a home or an interior scheme or whatever it is, the same said with hotels. And there's one example that I want to use. I don't know if you know the Now London Hotel. So they've opened, and I mean, there's colour everywhere. But what's interesting is your point about geographical, and that hotel isn't actually catered to a London audience or a British audience. In fact, it's actually catered for travellers staying there and experiencing London. So you'll see things like, I mean, Big Ben as a rocket in the lobby. There's green everywhere, and it's massively it's a colourful environment. But it does showcase how far you can go. And I feel as if designers and architects that are potentially on this call today and listening and the webinar, to be bold and to I mean, it's designers are almost salesmen and women when it comes to their clients. And if they're confident in their decisions on colour, then 9 times out of 10, or maybe not, their clients will respond well to that.
Great answer. Ben, I mean, you and I have chatted a little bit about this before, but if I was to sort of say to you, you know, people are afraid of colour, and actually that ultimately has an impact on well-being because it stifles creativity perhaps, and maybe even children aren't sufficiently stimulated with colour, etc. What would you say? What would be your...
Well, I think firstly it's an important point to touch upon that I'm coming at this from the point of view of an architect, as opposed to, we've obviously got some interior specialists on the call. So I think for architects, we do see colour in a slightly different way, partly because our, you know, the outside of our buildings are seen by everybody, and we often have quite difficult battles with planning officers who can be quite resistant to anything too bold and too out there. So actually sometimes I think our current planning system does encourage a little bit more conservatism, and also there's that thing of, you know, how easy is it to change? It's much easier to change an interior to repaint than it is a whole facade of a building. So there is an idea of kind of permanence there that's quite interesting to think about. Sorry, your original question was... Well,
it's around sort of general sort of fears of colour and...
Yeah, sorry. So in terms of, I mean, if we were to do a very quick history lesson, you look back at the modernists of the early 20th century, and they basically proposed the classic Le Corbusier villa with no colour anywhere, pretty much white everything. And actually a lot of their inspiration was taken from classical buildings, which we now know, for example, classical Greek buildings were painted bright colours, even though we see them as white in all the images now, because the paint and colour has all disappeared. So actually, you know, we're kind of inspired, or a lot of architects are inspired by this modernist thing, which actually wasn't necessarily based in reality anyway. And there's a very good book I'd recommend to people by Ingrid Fettel-Lee called Joyful. And it's a really interesting read. In that, she really argues that colour and joy and, you know, trinkets, things that bring us joy, bring us pleasure, are actually really important. But we've been encouraged through this kind of trend in terms of minimalism and throwing away anything that doesn't bring you love, as on one recent Netflix TV show. We've been encouraged to kind of declutter and simplify and remove colour, but actually, you know, joy is so important to us and to our everyday lives. We need those moments of joy every single day, and buildings are a way that they're one of the many ways that we can experience joy every day. And I think colour is just one of the tools we can use to do that.
Great. And Vanessa, presumably there's nothing there you're going to disagree with, because
no,
everything in your world is about the joy of colour, right?
It is, well, especially in my world, yes. And I try and encourage it as much as possible. I think it's, but it is very difficult. People really do have a fear of colour, and they will, you know, have a big sitting room, or they might do it in a dining room if they have one. In the, you know, countryside might do a great colour, but you know, I try and encourage people to, you know, just try a little room, do anything, just give it a go. A corridor, well, kids' bedrooms actually are usually pretty colourful. They seem to have a lot of joy, and people seem to, you know, not worry about putting a lot of colour in there. And it's just a shame that people don't have that same kind of sense of, actually, I'm going to use it more. But then there's also that contrast of, when we go back to the well-being and wanting kind of tranquility and that sense of harmony and peacefulness, maybe people don't associate very strong colours or bright colours. With that, maybe they want something that's much softer and more muted and gentler on the eye. So I think it all comes down to personalities and especially for me with clients, what they're like and their lifestyles. And you know, if I have clients that love colour, we try and push it as much as possible. But yes, I think overall there is a slight fear of it.
And presumably we have to remember that this isn't just about walls, and it's not just about paint. You know, there are a million and other ways to.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Into a project of any kind.
Yeah. So you can bring it in with the fabrics and you know and the sanitary ware as well. I mean, I love the sound of the basin.
I think for us it's also, yeah, as you're saying, Vanessa, it's about considering the function and purpose of the use, and you know, that function, the way people are going to use a space should drive everything about the way you design it. For us, buildings, they're the backdrops to people's lives. We want them to empower and enable people to live better lives. We don't want them to restrict and restrain people. And similarly, you know, if you were to design a cinema room or a meditation room or a reading room, you probably wouldn't want it in like fluorescent highlighter pink. But that could work really well in like a gym or whatever, yeah, you know. So
I think, Ben, when you were talking about biophilic design, I feel as if that could offer a real solution for those that fear colour, because it's a subtle way to inject colour into the interiors and architecture as well.
Yeah, and all those colours are so relatable. We experience them every day, hopefully, depending on where you live.
Just picking up on the biophilia sort of theme there, I'm not sure if any of you want to sort of raise a hand who wants to talk about this, but are we kind of at saturation point a little bit on biophilia? I mean, every time I go to an event, a seminar, a webinar, you know, read an article, somebody is introducing me to the concept of biophilia, and I think, oh, come on, you know, we all know about it. But how, I mean, perhaps Constantina, maybe, and then perhaps we could talk to Vanessa again, but with the projects that you're working on, how aware is the client and the market about biophilia, and is it over, or is it nearly over?
I would say that, you know, we and I particularly, I've always been interested in the connection between the inside and the outside, and even before we started talking about biophilia, you know, if you look at architecture from different eras, you know, that the connection between the spaces, courtyards, open courtyards, kind of organic architecture, that was always there. So when it comes to thinking about color and materials, it's always a question of harmony and a connection between what happens on the architecture, what happens on your doorstep when you kind of like leave your space, and what happens inside. And I think it's about achieving a sense of harmony and a nice transition, so you don't have kind of like a jumpy feeling and like something that startles you, but something that kind of encourages you to have a nice kind of harmonious movement between inside and outside and nature. On many of our projects, we even though it's interior design, we design for the outdoors too. So, you know, we have rooms that spread out on balconies or on poolsides, or I call it colonizing spaces, because we just create moments even in the outdoors. And we don't necessarily call it biophilic design or not. It's just, I think, a nice way to think of environment in general.
Great.
If can I jump in? Sorry.
Yeah, please.
You wouldn't speak X. But to me, asking if biophilic design is over is a bit like asking, is daylight over? Or you know what I mean? It's we know that it's scientifically and inherently something that does make us feel better as human beings. And I think you kind of go back to, well, anything like pre-1900s, really, we would have had natural materials in almost all of our buildings. And there's so much research out there that does support biophilia and biophilic design. Even just being in a room in contact with natural materials like timber can reduce people's heart rates, make them feel calmer, increase things like release of oxytocin, so feel-good chemicals. So I don't think biophilia will ever be over. I just think we, you know, as you rightly say, the media has been, you know, the design media has been pushing that point for a long time, and I think in terms of media saturation, maybe we're there, but in terms of design, I don't think it's.
It'll just be an implicit part of.
Yeah, it will be almost, I think, an accepted norm. Yeah.
I think from a media perspective, it adds so much depth to a project if it's got an interesting story, and if that story is based on how, you know, they brought architecture into the interior design. One case study I've got that comes to mind is Jade Mountain in St. Lucia. They actually removed the fourth wall, so it's completely open to nature. And the interior design scheme is very residential, but you know, you're fully immersed in nature. And the fact that the architecture, there was a lack of right angles in order to open that relationship up even more. I feel as if from a design journalist perspective, that sets that project aside from any other. I do feel as if the word biophilic design maybe become a bit more muted just as it becomes the norm, because I feel as if, you know, the industry is educated and there's no need for patronization, but actually it's just interesting to understand how to authentically blend in nature in new ways and meaningful ways as well.
I think it's very similar to sort of the lighting market, because we used to talk about energy efficiency as though that was something that was special. Now it should be a given, shouldn't it? And it's an implicit thing. So I think it's an interesting point. But we had a question actually that came up that about post-occupancy evaluation, which I was going to bring up later, but I wonder if it's a good time just to pull that in now. I mean, Ben, I mean, maybe you know, but are you aware of any sort of measurement of kind of impact on it, perhaps on the projects that you work with in your day job, or even kind of just through some of the things you write about? But my understanding is that post-occupancy evaluation of well-being measures, if you like, is often squeezed out in the budget at the very end, which is a great shame.
Yeah, one of the positives, the well building standard, which we are trying to incorporate on quite a few of our newer projects, actually it needs post occupancy evaluation for you to actually get certified. You have to commit to doing surveys post occupancy, and I will admit, certainly as an architectural industry, it's something that I don't necessarily think we've been good enough at as an industry, especially in residential, where we do a lot of our work, because it can be challenging to get developers or clients to allow you to go in and do that POE, but it's something we're doing more and more. We've actually just developed something in conjunction with the RIBA called the Social Value Toolkit, and the idea is for us to go back in after completion of projects and speak to residents and understand really how all elements of a project added value. So it could be anything from the layout to the provision of nature to you know, how we whether we've given them gardens or high ceilings, all those kind of things. So it's moving in the right direction, but yeah, I think as you've identified it, historically it hasn't been done as much as it should have been.
Yeah. Hamish, are you aware? I mean, not necessarily the sort of the scientific kind of numbers, but are you aware of any projects that you've covered and written about where there is some form of commercial, perhaps, measurement of the impact of you know, that connection between well-being and the space in the project? I mean, obviously we're talking about colour, but it's all part of a bigger picture.
There's a hotel called Inhabit, London, which is near, where is it? Near Paddington. I'm not aware of any specific example of that, but what I am aware of is the design studios that really sort of champion and where sustainability and well-being and, you know, it is at its core. So that hotel particularly was of interest because it was a grade 2 listed building, which tends to be the first excuse as to why developers can't, you know, add sustainable elements to the architecture and design, and yet it is completely sustainable. It is completely, you know, there are zero waste and all sorts. So I think it's a real shame because actually, from that perspective, as a journalist, we don't hear that side of the story half the time. We're very much presented with the polished piece as to, you know, how the designer and developer managed to achieve this design. Where we try to change that and to challenge it is by offering these concept to completion articles where we try to understand a little bit more of the fabrics. But I'm yet to have an example for you, Joe, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, that's has anybody got one? I mean, I was wondering.
Constantina might.
I just wanted to say that, you know, sometimes it's really difficult to evaluate everything and measure it because you can't. And if you try and measure everything and you know, kind of position things in a hierarchy, I think that's what makes people in the end feel fearful of colour. Because we're going back to saying what is right and what is wrong. So for all the things, you know, like if we talk about biophilia or colour, it's all these things work together. It's not just one element that might make something successful, and we can't always measure whether it's commercially successful or whether it's people feel great if they walk into that space. It's really difficult to do that, and I think we should steer away of trying to kind of explain everything. We should just enjoy it and just have fun and experiment, and we're not always going to get it right, and we'll just try and do the best that we can.
I think that's a great advice, and I can't argue with that. I know I chatted to Hamish in advance of this, and we talked a little bit about brand and colour and well-being. And Hamish, I wonder if you wanted to kind of just sort of talk about this because I think one of the things I sort of asked you was whether you thought that perhaps certain brands are going to be perhaps impacted on perhaps adversely, because that sort of drive for that sense of well-being that we're going to need. I'm talking particularly as the landscape has changed in the last 3.5-4 months.
Yeah.
How does that work out? How are we going to?
So I think it goes back to my point on subconscious. From a consumer's perspective, for things to just appear and be subconscious and just make you feel a certain way. No longer is branding about slapping a logo on a product. It very much is more about the feeling that brand evokes through what it can offer. So a few examples. There's this one which is Zedwell Piccadilly, which is designed pretty much purely for sleep performance, and the moment you walk in you feel relaxed. The same with the Equinox brand in New York that they launched last year, and I mean that's a really interesting case study to look at, because it's a very high-end luxury fitness brand, and they have now, they're now operating in the hospitality sector. So there's that whole link between wellness, well-being, fitness and hospitality. I also think recently with spas, for example, there's a huge question mark on spas, rightly or wrongly, post-pandemic. But I personally feel like wellness will be more injected into all areas of the hotel, and that will come across in colour, and that will come across in design, and bathrooms will become more inviting spaces. Maybe we've talked to Constantina about the basin colour. I know Burlington brand have just launched their latest collection as well, which is all around bespoke, interesting bathroom products. Obviously Matrix is launched as well. There's so many brands now that are injecting more options for designers, and I feel as if that's helping them sort of position their brands within the hotel experience without having to put a logo on a product. And also there's loads of big high-end hotel groups that are now opening these lifestyle brands that I'm sure they don't want you to sort of associate them with the Marriotts or the IHGs. But what's happening now is there's so many distressed assets post-pandemic, because the independent hotels weren't able to sustain themselves with no revenue coming in. They didn't have anything in the bank necessarily. And they're sort of being bought by these bigger brands, and they're being rebranded into new brands, sub-brands. So there's a whole, it's all changed, I think. But what will remain really important is designers making meaningful decisions to enhance the hotel experience all the way through. And I feel as if that's what hospitality is trying to do anyway. And any brand is trying to create a welcoming environment. And it's amazing how much you can actually do with colour to really evoke that brand's sense.
Fantastic answer. I wanted to try and pick up on some of the questions. We've got a few that have been submitted in advance, and there's some that are appearing on the screen. And if anybody's got any questions, I'd ask you to put them in the Q&A, which is a function within Zoom. And there is actually one. I wondered perhaps if Vanessa might want to pick this one up, which is from Veronica Kingsley, and she's talking about the connection between interiors and fashion, and how we can link fashion with the science of colour to actually affect mood. Vanessa, is there any chance you might want to pick up on that?
Well, I think there's a very strong link between fashion and interiors, and there always has been. So when trends come out in fashion, invariably, well, or interiors or fashion, there tends to be some kind of link. So colours that come in, and also I think that with the whole trend of fabrics and recycling and sustainability and natural materials and all the things that are really important, becoming so important in fashion, also coming so important in interiors. So there's not just the color element, but there's also, and I think there's style, the styles of fashion and the styles of interiors. They really, they kind of work together unconsciously. I think that they're trends, and so yes, I think there's a big link between the two.
Constantina, anything do you want to pick up on that?
I agree. I mean, we move in the same world. I'm having a conversation in the next couple of weeks with a creative agency in Paris called Curative Agency, and their work is about trends, formulating trends and seeing what is happening in the wider community and society, and like expressing them through color and through consultation. And I work with all the big fashion brands as well as interiors. So it is connected, and I think, we dress, we are in the spaces, we think of color not as, separate from interiors or fashion, with the difference, I think, only that fashion is a lot faster, the cycles. But our work is definitely inspired by fashion. And there's a lot of interesting things happening there that we look at and we take and express through interiors. So there is a lot of infusion, I think, both ways. The nice thing is what happens when we build something and all the the bloggers and the fashionistas come flocking, and they take our work as a background to what they're doing, which is the other side of the same thing. Yeah, that's the fun part.
Thank you.
However you dress it up with trends or movements or whatever word you use, there's certainly, I mean, I identify quite often on the editorial desk where, a number of different suppliers will be churning out a similar style of design or a similar sort of, maybe style, I guess is the right word. And I think that definitely happens as technology improves and, more options are readily available for suppliers.
Thanks, Hamish. I just want to move on another question, and maybe Ben, if you're comfortable answering, this is from Tom Bourne. Will a more sophisticated approach to colour in interiors drive new emotional responses in building users? I mean, obviously, you're coming at things from, perhaps more the commercial end, although I know you do all sorts of projects, but we're having some quite sophisticated conversations about colour today, and I think that, the built environment, generally is becoming more fluid in terms of aware of well-being. What's your view about about that from a building users? I mean, you're designing for all sorts of people, aren't you?
Yeah, well, that in itself is a good point, in that it's a very different experience doing a one-off home for an end client as opposed to a lot of what we do, which can be either homes or offices, where retail space where we don't actually necessarily know who the end user is going to be. And again, I think it ties back to that idea of fashions. For us as architects, we almost want to detach ourselves from fashion. We want our building to look great in 100 years, not just in the next 5 years. So I think that's potentially one of the reasons why we are, as architects, slightly probably more tentative with colour. But again, I would just say we have to keep trying to go back to that evidence, and perhaps Constantina and I are maybe opposite ends of the spectrum on this, but it was drilled into me at architecture school that you should never make a design decision just because you like it, because we see that as fetishism, really. You could say, well, I like curves, so I'm going to do something curvy. But actually, if you can turn around and say to your client, well, we know that people actually feel calmer around curvy spaces, around curved furniture, it's less threatening, it's seen as relaxing. All of a sudden, you've got evidence, you've got scientific data to back up your argument, and the same with colour. So there's an interesting study which you and I were chatting about, actually, Joanna, weren't we, last week in Tokyo in Japan, where they were trying to reduce suicide rates. So at train stations, sadly, a lot of people take their own lives by jumping in front of trains, and they actually decided to introduce blue lighting at train stations as an experiment because they believed it would make people less impulsive, and actually suicide rates did come down quite drastically. So we know that we can use colour in certain ways to elicit certain emotional responses, and even potentially affect people's, not just the way people feel, but the way people behave. And so for me, that's the really interesting next step of this. And I know amazing people who, you know, like Dr. Craig Knight is now starting more research into colour, I believe, and it'll be really interesting to see what they discover as they push forward. But I can only imagine in 10, 15 years time, we're going to have a really good scientific understanding of how different colours tend to make people feel on the whole. Of course, there's much broader issues as well, like ideas of culture and the fact that colours can mean different things to different cultures. So, you know, in China or a lot of countries, red could be a colour of celebration, but in a lot of African countries, it can be a colour of mourning and death. So we again, something else we need to consider when we're selecting colours is that kind of wider impact it can have on people because of associations, and particularly as we live in a more and more global society.
I think, you know, we've covered a lot on work in mind around mental health issues and how you positively impact the built environment, and actually there's been a few articles about the colour pink, and I know we have one particular piece which was about Overbury, who were trying to reduce mental health issues in the construction sector, and had painted the restrooms for construction sector workers in a particular pink called Baker Miller pink, and the impact was very significant indeed. And I was chatting to Vanessa actually the other day, because Vanessa, you mentioned pink as a colour that had a particular impact on, and you'd looked at it for a project you were working on. Is that right?
I was actually doing a talk a few years ago, and it was about colour and paint, and I was looking at new trends, and actually pink has been in for the last few years. I think it'll be around for a long time, but I wanted to kind of find out a little bit more about the colour, and actually on a bit of research found out that in the 1970s in America, the prison service actually decided to trial painting the inside of the prisons pink, even down to the bedding being pink and the clothes for the inmates, to calm them down, to make a much more kind of less aggressive atmosphere, and it did work, and they rolled it out to quite a few prisons in the US, but that was back in the 70s. So I mean, it's fascinating how long, you know, there's been this kind of research into colour and well-being, and how it affects mood and how we all respond to it around us. And that's why I think it's great that, you know, we've got more pink and greens and these kind of colours coming into our living environments. And I think it's because we want to calm down and have kind of more harmonious spaces to live in.
On to another question, which I think I will ask Constantina to help me with, is around texture, and how does texture influence the colour? Is there a particular process that people like yourself use when selecting, you know, colour to go with texture? Are you able to?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, super. Texture is very important for me and for every material that we look at. You know, if we think about how, not just what you see, but how you feel, and you know, if you're touching something, if you're walking on a surface, and how that feels. So texture, color, all of those things we look at together, and it's never really on one thing on its own. It's always about how things are composed and how they all come together to give that feeling. Yeah.
What I'm excited about.
And by the way, I have something pink working on right now, which is very earthy pink in large scale. In a couple of months, I'll be able to share.
Can't wait.
But I do share the feeling of how it's kind of calm, and I think pink has been one of those colors that was for a long time kind of off the radar and very, I don't know, you thought of pink as a Barbie pink, but there's so many nice tones to it. And I mean, I'm just looking at a wall here, which is a very kind of nice ochre kind of pink, very kind of like muddy, earthy, which is lovely. So there's so much to talk about, and so many different approaches, but colour's here to stay for sure.
Hamish, did you want to just pick?
It kind of takes it away from colour for just 2 seconds, but what I'm really excited about is designers and architects looking at sound as well, and sound working with colour and sort of creating this overall environment that's, you know, actually capturing the aim of what you're trying to capture as a designer or an architect or a client. And I feel as if there needs to be more research, and there will be more research into how the relationship between colour, texture and sound working as one. And another thing as well, just wanted to mention what Ben was saying about how you were trained, Ben, and what you were told about, you know, meaningful decisions. The projects that I feel are the most impactful that I see from an editor's perspective are the ones where the designer and the architect are working together from the off, but totally offering different perspectives. So there's an emotional perspective and there's a more rational perspective, and then together it blends really nicely. Obviously, I don't know how that looks behind the scenes, but but that tends to be the best the best relationship and best result I see.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions about using colour in products as opposed to spaces. There's something about product design, but Gemma Queenborough has asked, do you have any hints and tips about using colour in products as opposed to spaces, and any resources you could suggest? I'm not quite sure who might be best to look at that. Perhaps Constantina maybe, or Vanessa.
Colour in products. Oh, okay.
No, go.
And you know, a lot of the time when we think about, say, a restaurant, and we go, okay, you know, this is going to be the colorway, this is how the palette works together. It's not just the big surfaces that we think of, you know, the flooring or the walls, but it's also down to, you know, the plate, or you know, is the wine glass or the water glass like colorful. And those little touches, is the piping on the cushion, like that kind of accent that picks up on the marble on the table. So it is nice, and it helps a scheme to become harmonious when you can. So if you have a dominant color, to kind of like sprinkle it somehow on many kind of different applications, including products or lighting or soft furnishings. So yeah, and I think it's also, I think sometimes the easiest is to go, if you're experimenting, to go small with like colorful product before you go big. You know, I think it takes a little bit of courage to paint a ceiling a color. And when we, you know, I heard earlier about the question about architecture and design and how, you know, whether we clash or not. But I've always worked with architects together, and with a common kind of like objective is to make a successful hotel. And there's been, you know, a lot of conversations many times about areas where the architects may not want us to apply anything to, you know, parts of a building that are very important to them. It might be the structure, it might be, you know, the columns that you can find everywhere throughout a building. And in those cases, you know, when there is a conversation and a dialogue, you find ways of kind of like getting the scheme to work in your own way. So in this particular one, this was the Hilton in Amsterdam at Schiphol Airport. The architect didn't want us to do anything on the columns. There was many white columns in the space, and it's a beautiful, iconic sculptural building. But we used a lot of color. I mean, we did huge rugs in the lobby, and if you see, if you walk through the lobby, it's got a nice deep blue, like a Dutch kind of KLM strong blue that comes through. So yeah, I mean, I think architects and interior designers can work together as long as there's a dialogue going on, no fighting.
Agreed.
Hamish, I've got a specific question for yourself here from Nicola Kent. Have you seen any colour trends as prevalent in the hospitality sector? So, I mean,
thanks,
Nicola. Yes. So,
what I see is actually a lot of neutrals, you know, and then colour sort of popping through in accents in artwork. For example, there's one case study that I've got in mind, which is Matetsi and Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe. Basically, a very neutral colour scheme, but very meaningful in its design with authentic materials. And they, in each of the suites, they had an artwork piece, which was a very iconic, very sort of vibrant yellow. And when I asked the story about as to why that was there, they said that in each suite there's one of them, and together they form a map of the reserve, which I just thought was really wonderful to inject a sense of place. But I'd quite like to know, Vanessa, like, what was the decisions behind the colour scheme of Matrix? I'm genuinely interested to know.
Okay.
That sort of maybe answers the question that Joe said before as well.
Yeah, it was interesting actually, because it was I hadn't worked with tiles before, so I had to really kind of look at all the different areas of who would be buying the tiles, and whether that's you know, for domestic or commercial, you know, for people living in cities, but you know, people that want dark colors, want light colors. But I really wanted to create a palette that would all work together. So it was really important that every color that was chosen, that they could almost be grouped into tones. So as an example, let's say you had you wanted to do an apartment, a developer wanted to do an apartment, and you wanted to use the same product throughout, but have different tones. I love having that feel of depth, creating different little areas. And with these tiles, you can use them in different areas, but you get different levels of color. So it was really creating a collection that had variety, but had a kind of lovely sense of, I guess it's well-being, and a kind of harmonious palette that would all work together. But what I really love is that they've created the grout and the edging to go exactly with the color. So when the tiles are used, it actually looks, you can do some wonderful things, have, you know, these incredible colors, and trim them and do all the grout in the same color, which I think is wonderful. Takes away some of the detail, keeps it lovely and simple. And yeah, no, it was great fun, I have to say, creating the colors. It was fantastic. Loved it.
Well, I think we're probably running slightly over now, so I think from my perspective, I think I probably will have to say thank you to all our panelists, and you know, sort of bid you all good evening. Sarah is looking at me on the screen. We haven't got any more time for any more questions, I don't think, but if anybody wants any information of any of the references that any of us have made, there have been a few points, just let us know, and we'll do our best, or Sarah and I can do our best to kind of get you the answers to that and the reference points. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening, and thank you to our panelists. You've been fantastic. Have a great evening.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
You too.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Joe.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Nice to meet you all.
Bye-bye.